So I'm Sandra Reyna, and just to give you a very quick note on my participation in AHC for the last, my goodness, I'm going to date myself right now, but for the last maybe even 12 years or so, I have been very much involved with AHC, and I got introduced to AHC by collaborating with investigators, who's Dr. Catherine Svoboda. And how I became acquainted with AHC is literally working with a family long distance, and they needed my assistance because of the language barrier. And so when I first met this family, because then we got to go to see the family, I was very impressed with the fact that we had a child, and in this case we had a family who we might have several affected members, and it was just very impressive to me to see the challenges that these families were facing with their affected child. And it made such an impact that I wasn't just there to help anymore. I was there all of a sudden. I felt very committed to continuing to take part. And so I want you to know that my determination and my collaboration is still there, even though I'm not necessarily in academia, and I'll tell you a little bit about that in a minute. That doesn't mean that I'm not constantly thinking about AHC. And so hopefully with my new role, my new now goal in life and mission is to see how I can help in maybe taking AHC into industry so that we can work together. So now I've taken a different position, and I was at Massachusetts General Hospital. From Utah, I moved there and then started my faculty career also at MGH. And then being there, I was recruited by Biogen because of my experience in rare disease, and mostly because of the many years that I have working with this other disease that I'm going to use as an example today, because I think that we have to learn from other diseases that have gone through the same challenges that we're going through with AHC, and also the road that they have crossed. We can take a lot of tips from that. And so I'm going to speak today a little bit about, as an example, about spinal muscular atrophy, which is another rare disease that affects many children. And it's not as rare as AHC, but it's pretty much up there. So I'll show you a little bit about that, about the history of that. So my disclaimers are that I'm a full-time employee at Biogen, also that I hold stock with Biogen. At the same time, I want you to know that I'm not here today representing Biogen. I am here today as a interested party who has been very dedicated to AHC. So I will not be in any way representing my company, and so I can't answer any questions about Biogen. Okay, so I have quite a few objectives today, and I'm going to trials. And so one of my goals, hopefully, is that we will discuss what a clinical trial is, and maybe just making the difference between an observational study and a randomized control trial, because it's not quite clear sometimes what that really means for parents. Also, describe what are the phases that lead to a clinical trial, which is also very confusing to parents. And at the same time, describe who are the key players when we're working on a clinical trial, and also what is the process here in the U.S. And so, why is Europe so different than the U.S. and why are some drugs approved in Europe versus the U.S. So a clinical study, what is a clinical study? If I were to, by a show of hands right now, and those of you who are just watching us through the web, just by a show of hands, I'll count and say how many there are, but how many families here have had the opportunity to work to be a participant in a clinical trial? So I have one hand up, two hands. Okay. Now we have a room full of people of about maybe 40 or so. So that just gives you an idea of really sometimes even the availability of a clinical trial for what it is that you're hoping to find for for one of his members in your family. And so understanding what a clinical trial is very challenging, but at the same time so a trial is really a test. A trial is also an experiment. A trial is not a treatment. So that we have to really, soak in, because this is where I see a lot of our families get very concerned, and they get, overwhelmed with the fact that they can't have their child participate in a clinical trial. And so when we have this opportunities and we design a study, there's many things that come into play, and we're going to have a little bit of test of that just with this room right here, and see what your opinions are as a parent. But what is a clinical trial? A trial can be participants receiving treatment according to a study protocol. A study protocol is a very defined method on how a study will be run. And there's no deviation from that protocol. And that means for the parents, it means also for the child, but in particular, it definitely means for the investigator who's running the study that they cannot just do whatever they think is right or whatever they think may be most appropriate at the time for that study, because maybe they feel that this is something that they need to do now and start changing the design. And so a study protocol is a binding document, and it took a lot of time to get to that formal and final copy. And when I say a lot of time, I mean sometimes it takes 2 years to get to one study protocol. And in that time, there's a lot being done. There's a lot of interaction with the families. There's a lot of interaction with investigators. There's a lot of interaction with the regulators, such as the FDA. And by the time we get to a study protocol, it means that we have now come to the very best decision ever to hopefully run this study in the best way possible. And most of all, it's safe. And that's really what a trial is trying to do. We're trying to run an experiment with human beings, but the most important thing that we keep in mind at all times, and so do our regulators, such as the FDA, is that a study has to be safe. Okay. So what else is a trial? We can have an observational study, and in an observational study, participants receive treatment based on a clinical practice. And so you hear about that, and I think some of us will be interested in knowing if there are trials available. And when we think of a trial, we automatically assume we have a drug. Well, that's not always the case. We do have a protocol, but that protocol can be observational protocol, and it can also be a natural history protocol. And that alone is not necessarily a trial, but it is a trial because we are collecting data. And this compilation of the data is very important because it will allow us to really learn more about the disease. So, what do we investigate in the trial? We can investigate medicinal products such as drugs. We can also do medical procedures, what works best. And we can also do changes in behavior. Now, when we have these opportunities to run a study, we are very, very good about trying to very much keep in mind the study population we're working with so that we can help in the best way possible to get the best results. We only get one chance. When we have a clinical trial and we design the trial, we have one chance. There's no going back to changing. We can amend to make the clinical trial better for the participant, but we cannot try to recreate the study if we're not careful in making sure that what we say we're going to meet is called an endpoint. An endpoint is like a target. So we have an endpoint, and if we can reach that endpoint, we will do everything possible to do so. But if you don't, we have what's known as a negative study. A negative study because you did not reach the endpoint. But that doesn't mean that it was a bad study. Okay, so when you hear the word negative study or had negative results, it just means we didn't meet our goal, but we learned a lot. So a negative study really converts itself to a positive study because we have learned now what were the shortcomings for that study and what can we do better next time. All right. So how is the treatment compared? Well, we have an experimental treatment, and of course that can be done with medications, and we also have a control. With the control group, we have a positive control, which will be given drug, or we also have a placebo control. And this is where, a placebo control is also known as a sugar pill. And these are key components of understanding how a trial is designed and how it's set. Because half of the time the families are hoping that, they get the drug for a hopeful response to benefit their family member. Now, when we are discussing and introducing the thought of clinical trials, we talk about randomization and blinding. Randomization is exactly what it is. It's at random. So it's really, a throw of a draw there to see where, your child or your family member will end up. And this is done statistically. It's not done by the physician or the investigator. It's a formula that's set. The investigators do not do this on their own. What they do is there's a system electronically already prepared to do this, and when the participant is enrolled in the study on their first visit, the randomization is submit the data into the computer, and something is thrown back at them immediately, and they will give them that arm of where the participant will be in. And and I'll talk about that in a second here, but the random assignment of a study participant to one treatment or another. And this is where are very aware of that, but once they realize that maybe they assume that their child or family member is not on the drug arm, families, sometimes stay away from it because they don't want to do that. They don't want to take that risk. They want something like an open label study, and that's a whole different story. So when we have randomization, I think that alone is telling me, and it should tell you, that this is a very well and controlled study, meaning we're going to try to reduce any bias, and at the same time we're also going to try to get the best data possible. And then we have the blinding. So the blinding study is one that parents are not aware of what arm their child or family member could be part of. At the same time, it's not only the participants, but also the investigator. And it depends if it's just single blind or double blind, meaning we're all blinded to the study, whether we have drug or we have placebo. So who takes part in all of this? I mean, how many people are involved? Now that I literally make the switch from academia into industry, it's been incredibly an eye-opener for me to see how much work has to get done before investigators. I mean, we know that in academia, and we appreciate that. No idea of the massive amount of hours. So when you hear the word sponsor, in my case right now, that would be quickly how many experts are out there for AHC. And so when it comes to a rare disease, it becomes even more critical of finding those specialists in the field and finding those patients. So the sites make the clinical trial. The sites can also break a clinical trial. So pharmaceuticals take this very seriously. And the networking begins way before even there's anything said about the study. If the disease is of interest to the pharmaceutical company, they sit down and they start figuring out, okay, if we do this, if we work on this disease, for example, AHC, if we work on AHC, who do we have to go to? Where are the sites? Who are the experts? Is it just nationwide? Do we have to go international? All these conversations take place, and they take place for days in and days out, for many hours, just trying to define the investigational sites, because we know that if we don't have what we need for the study, and sometimes having that many experts in the field is also not so not so available. So this is a very important team, which now you are part of. You as a family member with a child affected with AHC, you become part of that team. Then we have the institution review board. This is your ethics committee, also known as ethics committee. And our IRB are the regulators within the institution who will allow or deny, and they can for very clear reasons to them. Every institution, every university out there, they will have their own way of running their IRB. There's not one particular law in a sense that tells them exactly how they have to run their IRB. There are guidelines that are federated, and they follow those guidelines. How they interpret them, it's totally. And so we have some IRBs that are incredibly strict about almost every little thing, specifically with children. So when it comes to pediatric, challenging, because and that's what they're doing. They're protecting our children. They're also protecting you as a parent. And so our IRB is a very committee because it's looking out for the safety and the care of our participants. And having IRB approval is crucial. IRB approval, you would think that we get the protocols to this. We find the site, so we have a sponsor. We find the site. We now have a full protocol. We select the sites, and now we start working with them so they can submit the protocol that we designed to their IRB. Now, each IRB has their own also way of language. And so we have language with our document. We show it to the site, and the site takes it, presents it to the IRB, but they have what's known as a template of what the language is like for their institution and how they run clinical trials. And so we have to agree that sometimes the verbiage that they use compared to the verbiage that we have included in our protocol, sometimes they may vary just slightly. But we have to, as a sponsor, we have to agree that it's okay for them to switch the language to the way they want to comply to their, to their rules. So it's a lot of back and forth between IRBs, and by that time, this takes weeks. So the actual, timeline that we're hoping to have is a very quick turnaround. Well, it never happens. We have IRBs who can turn around and be totally approved by the time they submit, review, revisions come about. The revisions have to be then done by the investigator and the study coordinator. They get back to the IRB, it gets reviewed again, and then it's approved or it comes back again for more revisions. IRBs, depending on each institution, they may have once or twice, they meet a month. Some institutions meet every week, so it just varies. There's a lot of variables, and industry is aware of that. So one of the key questions they have when they're selecting a site is, how long does it take you to get IRB approval? We're hoping that it's 3 months. 3 months is about the average. We have sites that have taken a year to get IRB approval. So you can imagine those are things that I think our families are not aware of when it comes to having a study or bringing a study to a clinical site. Is the institution review board and the approval of that site to be a site. It's quite the process. So please keep that in mind too as you consider opportunities for clinical trials. Then we have a regulatory authority. Well, who are they? In the United States, it's the FDA. In Europe, is the EMA, and that's the European Medicinal Agencies. And so we have similar understandings of how we approve our studies. We meaning USA versus Europe. But it doesn't mean that our studies will be approved in the US and vice versa. You hear that some drugs are approved in Europe and they never come to the US. And that's just a regular regulatory process. And so our regulatory authority is the FDA. In industry, it's best to get work inside very quickly. So conversations begin very early with the regulatory group because we need their feedback. We need their support that this is a critical plan that we're trying to have here, because this is a very unique opportunity for many of these families affected by the disease that we're discussing. In this case, it could be AHC. So having conversations very early with the regulatory team, it's crucial. Open conversations, and they're also key to making a clinical trial a success. Then we have the contract research organization. So this is a CRO. You may hear that term, and this term really comes because our sponsor cannot handle the whole, all the work that has to be done. The PI or the investigator side. Then we have institution review boards that we have to work with. And they don't do anything with regulatory authority, let me tell you. So they never work or contact the FDA. A CRO is a company that works together with the sponsor to handle all the management of the study. And so the CRO, like Quintiles, for example, they work very closely with Biogen. And so they handle all their clinical trials, meaning they have a whole workforce that communicates directly with the sites. So, I'm a medical director where I work. I don't necessarily have to be on the phone or emailing the sites because my time should be used to do something else. And so we hire a group of people, and they're scientists, they're clinicians, they're nurses, heavily trained in the medical field. They understand the management of the study, and so they handle the study. And when they have problems, then they come to me and they go, Dr. Reyna, this such and such a site is continuing to do this, and we've tried everything possible to see how we can get their attention, but they don't seem to understand the urgency, for example, of what we're asking them to do. And so sometimes I intervene in that way. So in other words, when the sponsor intervenes, once we have a CRO in play, then I think the site can get a pretty good idea that something is game is done. Okay, the medical director should not be contacting them necessarily because we have a CRO who does that. So if I'm calling, usually it means something's happening. So it's a sign, and I'm very good about that. So and then we have the participants, and that would be the families who are interested in the study. And the participants, make the study. If we don't have the participants, we can't run the study that we're trying to do. Okay, now there are key steps in clinical trial development. And the first step is, like I said, your protocol development, your investigator selection, your protocol approval. We also have patient recruitment and participation. This is key. We may have all the first 3 items, but if I can't recruit study subjects into the trial is a failure. And not only recruitment, but the time in which we recruit. Everything is a timeline when it comes to a clinical trial. The industry is very good about setting timelines, and they set hard. So we have a calendar, and the expectations are really done in the sense that we want to meet those expectations because we know how much time it's going to take to recruit, to study, to keep the study subject enrolled in a study, whether it's going to be, if it's a study is set for a full year, for example, 12-month study, it means that patient has to be, or study subject has to be in the study for a full year. Well, recruitment is not happening all at once. It happens, in months, right? So we anticipate, we make calculations of the study population available. We make calculations, how long will it take to recruit? How many sites will it take to recruit? And, how quickly do you think we can recruit? And according to that, then we literally set those timelines, and we ask the CRO to comply with those timelines. So then we put a lot of pressure on the CRO to work very closely with the sites to make this recruitment a success. If we can't recruit our study subjects, then we don't have a study. And if it takes too long to recruit, it's money. Okay, and I'll tell you in a minute here how much studies can cost. Yes. Okay, so the question is, how many people do we need for a clinical trial? My next slide, I'm going to show you the different phases of a study, and I'm going to give you some numbers on what each phase will take and what each phase means. Okay, you bet. All right, so then, data entry and review. This is done throughout the time of the study, but at the same time, it's done to keep it, a clean data set. And so, let me clarify on this. We have a CRO, clinical research organization, who are collecting the data. They're definitely making queries. So they get back to the site saying, I can't understand what that means. Please clarify that for us. That's a query. And the sites are responsible for replying, because the idea is that we keep the data entry and review as clean as possible, because at any moment, if the industry decides this is time to start looking at data and do a cut of the data, they want clean data to look at. So it's a continuous process, okay? And it takes a lot of time to do this. I totally have an incredible appreciation for everyone who is involved in clinical trials, because I know what it is to run a clinical trial. I know what it is to be part of a clinical trial and to be responsible for a clinical trial. And I know how much time it takes. So, I'm constantly thanking and supporting our groups, specifically our study coordinators or clinical research coordinators, because they do an incredible amount of work. I mean, incredible amount of work. And a lot of times it's off hours, because they know how crucial this data is. And they become part of that study. They also, this also becomes part of their lives. So it's a mission. It really is an incredible mission. Then we have a statistical analysis. Well, statisticians, remember, our statisticians that work in clinical trials, they understand how to work with numbers. But they may not be aware of what the disease is really like. So I like to introduce our statisticians to the disease that I'm working on and just talk to them about the disease. So as a medical director, it's my job to answer clinical questions and to also make them aware of the disease. And that awareness takes them, it really helps them see numbers with people's faces in front. So that is a big piece of clinical trials. Presentation and publications of reports are also critical. Any study that's done, any clinical trial that's done, should be written up. It should be shared with the community, because we all learn from those reports. And of course, data filing and registration, that's our ultimate goal. If we have data and it's something that we can speak about, then we can file for a study drug approval. And that alone takes a lot of time and a lot of work. So as you can see here, it's not that simple. So when we randomize a control trial, what we're doing is exactly this. There is a formula that's set statistically, and they're going to be setting up a procedure where, again, as we register the participant into the study, there is an electronic system that takes care of, making sure that there is a significant, separation between those who will be getting the study drug and those who will be getting placebo. And it's not 50-50. Okay, so that's something that we also have to remember. The randomization is done, so there is a small portion of patients who will not be getting medication, the study drug. They will be getting placebo. And so when we look at randomization, we certainly have a potential study population, meaning the disease that we're working on. We're going to have a screen for enrollment. So what does that mean? You probably heard this already. Anyone who may be a possible candidate for any clinical trial has to be screened, meaning they have to meet the protocol design that now has a whole set of steps for inclusion criteria. And they have to meet all the inclusion criteria as it is written. So inclusion criteria cannot be modified by the investigator. And that is sometimes very hard to explain to parents. And there's no deviation from that. It's very clear, as there are exclusion criteria. If the exclusion criteria, one of the exclusion criteria is there, the child or the participant is excluded. That's what the screening is about. Okay. Then we have, if this is a randomized trial, we go through the procedure of assigning that randomization, and that's what's known as the control arm. and the experimental arm. So sometimes the control arm can also be healthy subjects. And for the most part, that's really who they are. And then we have the experimental arm, which are usually the participants with disease that we're looking into. And so what do we have here? So in the control arm, you can have a poor outcome or you can have a good outcome. Same goes for the experimental arm. You can flip-flop, good outcome or a poor outcome. Poor outcome meaning we didn't reach exactly our our goals or all our endpoints. And sometimes too, again, it can be very much affected by the number of subjects enrolled in the study, and sometimes also the side effects that are presented. And believe it or not, the placebo effect in a clinical trial is very real. And when we have randomization, it's something that we're very aware of, because families and the participant may believe that they're on drug, and their behavior changes. And so that placebo effect, we expect that in clinical trials. But again, statisticians are very good about sorting this out and trying to weed that out as quickly, depending on the data that we're looking at. So it's never good when the placebo arm does better than the drug arm. Okay, that tells you alone something is not good there. Okay, so we certainly don't want to see that. We want to see that there will be some placebo effect, meaning the subject feels better and does better. But the drug arm should do much better than that. Okay, so here we are. So the question about phases. So typically there are phases, meaning how many opportunities there are to hopefully get a drug to be approved. And so phase 1 has a very clear purpose. In phase 1 studies, it's a very small number of patients. And even though when you say 20 to 80, doesn't sound like small, it is small when it comes to a clinical trial. And sometimes it can be less than that. When we're referring to rare diseases, we may sometimes have to just do maybe half. That we also have documentation of very, very rare diseases where the numbers have been so small, but the effect of the study drug was so impressive that it can be approved, even in a very small set of patients. So for the most part, remember, this is something I really want you to take home tonight, and that is that phase 1 studies are usually healthy volunteers. And the reason for that is that we have to know that first, whatever study project we're looking at is going to be safe. And so safety is a big concern. So FDA tells you 3 things. They want to know safety, they want to know safety, they want to know safety. Okay, that's the FDA constantly reminding us about that. So in phase 1, we look at safety. We also look at how the medication works in your body. We also see how it interacts with your body. We're in drug interactions. So those are key factors, right, in a clinical trial. The number of participants again can be very small, but mostly healthy. So as you phase 1, you phase 2. It's a very short-term side of what the side effects of that drug could be, but it's starting to lean more towards to see if it's efficacious or not. And it could be, the number of patients could be a little bigger. And so we can look at several dozen set of patients up to maybe 300 or so. And subjects, now here is where the phase 2 studies now are looking at, once we establish that the medication is safe, then the next step is that we go to phase 2, but we have to prove that, okay? That phase 1 has to be proven. And then we start looking at subjects with the disease that we're trying to study for the effect of the investigational product. The phase 3, this is the exciting times. When you hear phase 3, this drug is already in phase 3, you know that they have gone through that rigorous process of phase 1 and phase 2, which take time. And now we're looking deeper, continue to look at safety. Notice I've written the word safety there again, because that's a big factor in any trial. But we're looking at safety and efficacy to see what what the labeling is going to look like for that medication. So let me explain a little bit about what that. Think about AHC, and when you think about a possible compound coming to the market, the discussions on labeling are going to be huge. And I think with AHC, I can already appreciate that, because we already know right now what we have available for AHC, and we have some of the populations that we understand maybe what's causing AHC because of that gene mutation that they present. But then we have the other part of the population who we still don't know. And so when it comes to writing this on a label, you would think it'd be easy to say, oh, it's for AHC. Well, it doesn't work that way. In industry, they have numerable amount of hours just discussing the label piece of it, because it has to be very specific. And in order for them to say AHC as in, as a whole, they have to prove that to the authorities. And I don't believe that this is right, because I understand from the data that I'm looking at, you're telling me only about 50% of your study population may have this gene mutation and have an effect. So what happened to the other 50%? I don't think it's going to, we believe it will not be safe for them. And that's all they have to say, and that drug is not going to be approved. So when it comes to labeling, it's a big deal. And so they have to be very good about understanding the full length of the disease and understanding how that medication could work on each child. And so that alone is going to take, quite a bit. And the same thing here. The numbers can be pretty large, but we usually, in rare disease, we can't get to that number. 3,000 patients in rare disease is just not going to happen. But usually, we know that it can go up there for drugs, for example, such as for hypertension, diabetes, asthma, chronic illnesses. I've seen studies even higher than those numbers. And so now we will continue to focus on the disease that we're trying to find a start a drug for. In the phase 4, this is kind of the final stage of the medication. But in phase 3, and in my next slide, I'm going to show you how everything takes place when it comes to approval time. But here in phase 4, we're looking at efficacy in post-marketing setting, meaning the drug has been approved. And now we are, looking at possible new indications of the study drug. We're also looking at the quality of life of these patients after now being on the study drug. And we continue to do surveillance. So phase 4 studies are wonderful studies to do, because what we do is we continue to learn about the medication. And so many medications are still being studied, even though, and as you can imagine, this is also taking a lot of time and money. So the number of participants is variable, because we just don't, we keep adding more and more. So for example, in the disease that I'm continuing to work right now, which is a rare disease that I told you about, spinal muscular atrophy. When we get to that stage of phase 4, a lot of patients right now, in the very beginning of the studies that we're using this medication on, we know that right now this number is going to be much bigger, because we are going to continue to study the study subjects on that drug even after approval, because we have to monitor. That's really what it is, surveillance. And so this, of course, continues to be with the same disease. So, what do we have to do to get the FDA to approve our medication? Well, there's a set of steps here, which I've covered slightly, but let me tell you how it all begins. It begins with doing a lot of experiments and a lot of studies in the preclinical phase, and that means that's preclinical research. It's usually done in animal studies. So there's a lot to be said about trying to find that compound, and we had wonderful talks yesterday where it was mentioned several times of how many compounds can be studied to see if we get a hit, right? So looking at that synthesis and purification of a compound can take a long time, and it takes a lot of compounds to come together to see if it has the effect that we're hoping it would have on what we know about the disorder of the disease. And so animal testing is used. Nicely enough, at AHC, we have a mouse model, so that's huge when it comes to finding a when it comes to finding a drug. It can be short-term or it can be long-term. Long-term meaning it's going to continue on as we find maybe other opportunities and maybe testing different reactions of the medication in the animal model. Then we are going to work into our phase studies, and that once we can prove that there is some effect and that this compound can now be taken into human, this is where our phases begin. And then we, when we're looking at phase 3, in phase 3, we have a new drug application review, which is NDA, and this is huge because that means that it's being filed for approval. So when industry speaks about filing, it means that they have literally been very successful in doing preclinical work, clinical trials that has taken them now to do a new drug application review to the FDA. And then from that point forward, we are now looking at post-marketing studies, which I mentioned to you, which are phase 4. We can also have an observational study, and we can have investigator-initiated trials, meaning if the PI, who is now very familiar with that medication, suggests there can be a subgroup of patients continuing to do a different type of study protocol, industry looks at that very seriously. So investigator-initiated trials are always important because they are the experts, okay? And industry respects that. So all in all, well, no one's asking how long is this going to take? It takes many years to do this. All these phases here, all this work does not happen in a year. It doesn't happen in 5 years. It can be anywhere from 10 to 15 years. And so that is a huge commitment when it comes to supporting a drug development program. And that's where I am right now, yes. Fluorescein is not in any process right now for clinical trials. There's no formal study out there right now, no formal clinical trial for fluorescein. Yeah. So how is fluorescein being given in the U.S.? It's not. It's not, right. Right. So families are doing this on their own. And the FDA is aware of that. So when it comes to bringing fluorescein to a clinical trial, again, it would have to be the pharmaceutical who takes this on and makes this 10 to 15-year commitment to invest that money in getting a clinical trial going. And that's not to say that they won't do it. We never anticipated, a rare disease like to finally come, and it did. And it took a lot of work. So I'm going to show you here in a second how we did that in a rare disease. So eventually, it got to work on all these phases, and now they're very close to the end of a phase 3, to hopefully see the results of that phase 3, to maybe now do an NDA, a new drug application. Yes. Yes.
On that point about fluorescein and whether or not it will ever be approved, the one thing is there any possibility, since the FDA is aware that people are being given it for AHC, but there's nobody who's paying for it, private insurance, Medicare, Medicaid, none of them ever pay for it. I'm paying $5 a day, and I'm not making any money. Only Social Security. So, I mean, it's a burden. Is there any way that you can just have them convince Medicare or Medicaid or somebody to pay for it?
Right. Dennis, that's a very good question. And I think that right now, the FDA is always very, very good and very cautious about protecting, protecting the patient. Okay, and that's what they always think about. So the FDA alone, they're not going to approve anything without any data. So having said that, we literally have to do all that work that I just talked to you about in order for the FDA to even consider reviewing the information that's been gathered about this product. So in other words, the FDA is not the regulatory group that's going to allow a physician necessarily to provide the drug unless they do what's known as like individual, investigational IND. So sometimes that can be considered and that can be done. You have to file to do an off-label administration of this drug for that one patient. So that can be done. It can be also, it's also known as compassionate use.